Can see me and hear. Hello, everyone. Welcome to CIVIC's second gathering for the spring 2023 quarter. This event is also co-sponsored by UCR's Center for Ideas in Society. CIVIC, or the Council for Intellectual Values and Inclusive Community, is a new grassroots group on campus started by Professor Stephen Brint and me in the fall of 2022. CIVIC's mission, in short, is to encourage open inquiry, viewpoint diversity, and constructive disagreement. We hope to reinvigorate a campus culture that prides itself on holding rigorous discussions, encouraging complex and challenging topics, and to do so in good faith and with the intention to learn from and understand one another better. Today, we will be having a panel discussion to talk about the rapid growth and consequences of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion offices around the country, focusing on their role in universities. We've invited three distinguished guests here today for the panel. First, here in person, joining us is Dr. Carlos Cortez. Dr. Cortez is the Edward A. Dixon Emeritus Professor of History at the University of California, Riverside. He's currently co-director of the UCR School of Medicine's Health, Equity, Social Justice, and Anti-Racism curriculum. Since his retirement in 1994, he served on the faculties of the Harvard Institutes for Higher Education, the Summer Institute for Intercultural Communication, and the Federal Executive Institute. During 2018-19, he was fellow of the University of California National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement. He received a University of California's 2021 Constantine Panunzio Distinguished Emeriti Award. Consultant to many government agencies, school systems, universities, mass media, private businesses, and other organizations, Cortez has lectured widely throughout the United States, Latin America, Europe, Asia, and Australia on the implications of diversity for education, government, private business, and the mass media. His books include his memoir, Rose Hill, An Intermarriage Before Its Time, the 4-volume Multicultural America, a multimedia encyclopedia, his book of poetry, Fourth Quarter Reflections of a Cranky Old Man, great title, which received honorable mention in the 2017 International Latino Book Awards. Other books include The Children Are Watching, How the Media Teach About Diversity, The Making and Remaking of a Multiculturalist. So, secondly, from Zoom, we've got two guests together there on one screen. Please welcome Amna Khalid. Amna is an associate professor in the Department of History at Carleton College in Northfield, Minnesota. She specializes in modern South Asian history and the history of medicine. Born in Pakistan, Amna completed her bachelor's degree at Lahore University of Management Sciences. She went on to earn master's in development studies and doctorate in history from Oxford University. Amna is the author of multiple book chapters on the history of public health in 19th century India, with an emphasis on the connections between Hindu pilgrimages and the spread of epidemics. Growing up under a series of military dictatorships, Amna has a strong interest in issues relating to censorship and free expression. She speaks frequently on academic freedom, free speech and campus politics at colleges and universities, as well as at professional conferences. Her essays and commentaries on these same issues have appeared in outlets such as the Chronicle of Higher Education, The Conversation, Inside Higher Ed, and The New Republic. She hosts a podcast and accompanying blog called Banished, which explores censorship in the past and present. I can vouch it's a very good podcast, and I'm a podcast junkie. So, Amna is a fellow at the University of California National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement this 2022 and 23 academic year, along with her colleague who's also here, Jeffrey Snyder. They're completing a project called Anti-CRT Bills Come to Campus, documenting and analyzing emerging threats to free expression and academic freedom from state legislatures. And finally, please welcome also via Zoom, Jeffrey Snyder. Jeff is an associate professor in the Department of Educational Studies at Carleton College. Snyder's work explores the connections between the history of education and broader trends in the US cultural and intellectual history, examining questions about race, national identity, and the purpose of public education in a diverse democratic society. Snyder has the keen interest in issues of academic freedom and free expression, especially as they relate to liberal arts education. Snyder is the author of the book Making Black History, The Color Line, Culture and Race in the Age of Jim Crow. He's a frequent contributor to newspapers and magazines, including the Chronicle of Higher Education, New Republic, Washington Post. He holds a BA from Carleton and an EDM in Learning and Teaching from Harvard Graduate School in Education and a PhD in History of Education from New York University. So we asked our panelists to prepare some opening remarks about their research and experience with DEI practices and ideologies, and then they will have a chance to respond to one another. Following that, their opening remarks and conversation, I will open the discussion to participants for questions and comments. I have some favors to ask. So the biggest favor to ask is that when it's your turn to speak, please make your comment or question concise, short, and direct. Please raise your hand and I will note that you want to speak when it's your turn and I'll call on you. It's going to be very difficult to kind of handle this room and that room, so we'll do our best. And please don't interrupt others when they're speaking, just some kind of natural decorum. With all that and the rules, please help me welcome our guests. So Amna and Jeffrey, you're up.
We're just trying to get our screen share.
Good, we see it.
Oh, great. Now you'll see all our slides because we're having to track back. But hi, everyone. It's great to be here. We're so excited, and we're incredibly excited to be on this panel with Carlos, who, by the way, I think you missed this. He was the consultant on Dora the Explorer. He was the diversity consultant on that program. So I'm going to hand over to Jeff now, who's going to do our formal introductions. I was just so excited that I just decided to take the stage.
Yeah, we're thrilled to be here. Thank you so much for having us. Thank you to CIVIC and CAS for sponsoring this event. Thank you to Amir Zaki and Stephen Brent for inviting us. It's a real honor to appear alongside Carlos Cortez. I feel like I'm an NBA backbencher who at some point will be able to tell my grandchildren, like I was on the same court as Steph Curry and LeBron. So we are absolutely thrilled and delighted to be here with Carlos and look forward to his comments and our discussion. So the title of this panel, right, is a question, DEI Inc, question mark. So before we lay out what our claims are, we want to first explain where this term comes from. So a few months back, Amna and I wrote an article in the Chronicle called, "Yes, DEI can erode academic freedom. Let's not pretend otherwise." So in this piece, we introduced the term DEI Inc. to give a name to what we see as the typical approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion on college and university campuses. So we want to make two claims today. We want to persuade you all of two things. First, that DEI Inc. is indeed a real phenomenon. And second, that DEI Inc. degrades the quality of learning and teaching on campus, mainly by curtailing free expression, academic freedom, and open inquiry. Right, so a definition, right? So what do we actually mean by this term, right? So DEI Inc. Is a logic, it's a lingo, and it's a set of administrative policies and practices. So let me spell out the logic. Education is a product. Students are consumers. Campus diversity is a customer service issue that needs to be administered from the top down. Chief diversity officers, according to an article in Diversity Officer magazine, are best defined as change management specialists. DEI Inc. purveys a safety and security model of learning that's highly attuned to harm. And the currency of harm is especially valuable in our current age of inclusion and belonging, where colleges and universities make grand promises to create, quote, environments in which any individual or group feels welcomed, respected, supported, and valued. Lived experience, the intent impact gap, microaggressions, trigger warnings, inclusive excellence. All right, you know the language of DEI Inc. when you hear it. It's a combination of management consultant buzzwords, social justice slogans, and therapy speak. The standard package of DEI Inc. administrative initiatives should be familiar too, from anti-racism trainings to bias response teams and mandatory diversity statements for hiring and promotion. Now, before we expand on the characteristics and consequences of DEI Inc., we'd like to pause to explain where we're coming from.
So as public critics of DEI initiatives, we've noticed that when we criticize these initiatives, a lot of people come back at us and they mistake it for hostility towards diversity and inclusion as values. And there's something really maddening about this. If you're on Twitter, you'll see what I mean. So here's the analogy we've come up with to try and clear up this confusion. While we're strongly in favor of public safety as a principle, the Department of Public Safety is a different matter. The notion that any criticism of law enforcement policies and practices means that we don't care about public safety is nonsensical. The same logic applies to DEI. So that's why we draw this sharp distinction between diversity, equity, and inclusion as concepts and values and what we today are calling DEI Inc., which is a very particular way in which these ideas have been operationalized and articulated in administrative language and institutional practices. So when it comes to DEI, broadly conceived, it's worth noting that our research and teaching are centered around issues of past and present social inequalities. And this is by way of explaining our own position. We're both historians. Jeff studies modern US history with an emphasis on how racism has shaped our public education, public school system. And I study colonialism in South Asia. So we're constantly talking about inequality and oppression. So I also want to underscore, as two people who've actually had the benefit of being in learning environments abroad, we really do deeply appreciate what diversity does for the learning experience. It enriches it and supercharges it. And we're very pro-diversity. This isn't merely a rhetorical commitment for us. We do believe that colleges and universities have an obligation to diversify their student bodies and their faculty. And they do need to make higher ed more accessible to populations who've historically been marginalized. But that doesn't mean that we endorse the full package of what we call DEI Inc. So one last note. While we're fierce critics of DEI Inc., I feel like we really need to spell this out at this particular moment. We are fierce critics of DEI Inc., but we're alarmed by the attacks on DEI programs by state legislators in places like Florida. And we firmly reject state intervention that aims to undermine the autonomy of universities. Happy to talk about more in Q&A. So with those clarifications in place, our talk today, we're going to focus on these key features of DEI Inc. Mandatory diversity statements, diversity and anti-racism trainings, bias response teams, and the discourse of harm that undergirds so much of what DEI Inc. is about. And we're going to talk about how it encroaches on academic freedom and the learning experience.
Okay, so first up, thinking about mandatory diversity statements, right? They're becoming de rigueur at colleges and universities across the country. In your very own UC system, diversity statements are scored according to a rubric. You can download it as an Excel spreadsheet at your convenience. Among the 5 criteria that are listed here are experience teaching students from underrepresented groups and research contributions to understanding barriers faced by women and racial or ethnic minorities. I think this made the Wall Street Journal and a few other papers a few years back when Berkeley, they had 8 departments in the life sciences who used diversity statement scores to screen job applicants. There were 893 candidates initially. 679 of them failed to progress through this initial DEI filter and didn't even have their scholarly credentials evaluated. So given their increasing prevalence, we shouldn't be surprised that there are now all kinds of guides and advice columns on how to write an effective diversity statement. All right, so as somebody who straddles the social sciences, kind of humanities, social sciences, Campbell's Law, this is one of the most robust principles in the social sciences, right? Stating that the more any quantitative social indicator is used for social decision-making, the more subject it will be to corruption pressures and the more apt it will be to distort and corrupt the social processes it is intended to monitor. And who said that academics can't write clearly? In other words, what that means is when you have numbers, when you've got numerical metrics determining outcomes, people will game the system, right? They'll do things you don't want them to do. So Amna and I have been thinking about these diversity statements as sort of relatives or related to the personal essays that students write to get into college, right? Diversity statements are inevitably going to become highly curated, formulaic, written with the express purpose of telling hiring and promotion committees exactly what they want to hear. They also pose a particular challenge for faculty who are on the right or even somewhere in the center politically. We agree with Abigail Thomas, who's a professor of mathematics at UC Davis. She has argued that diversity statements are tantamount to a political litmus test that serves as a filter for those with non-conforming views. So in the wake of George Floyd's murder, college universities across the country have enthusiastically embraced training of all kinds to promote racial justice, right? Sensitivity training, diversity training, anti-racism training, they go by different names. Amna and I aren't knocking training. It's got its uses. You want to learn Excel, you want to learn CPR. Training is excellent for that, but it's not particularly effective when it comes to DEI. I want to think about, walk through two examples of a college trying to deal with issues of race and diversity. The first is a typical training module, and the second takes an educational approach. Now, what I'm about to describe, by the way, is based on personal experiences that Amna and I have had directly with anti-racism training as participants, as well as the research we've done on standard diversity and anti-racism training models. So in many trainings, you'll be told that your racial identity defines who you are. You'll be informed, as we were, that white people are oblivious to race, while BIPOC people see everything through a racial lens. You'll probably also be informed that BIPOC people use the term BIPOC, which I found is not often the case. There's really no natural constituency for this term, but that's the lingua franca of diversity training. You'll often be sorted into racial affinity groups. You'll be told things like white folks use white talk, which is task-oriented and intellectual, whereas people of color use color commentary, which is process-oriented and emotional. That comes from Glenn Singleton's book, Courageous Conversations. You'll be told that traits like precision, individualism, and objectivity are hallmarks of white supremacy culture. You'll be asked, as we were, to list all of the racial stereotypes that you hold and to catalog all of the racial microaggressions that you have perpetrated. Okay. Oh, you'll also be asked to sign on the dotted line, as we were, that you are committed to transforming your institution into a, quote, fully inclusive, anti-racist, multicultural organization. Now, if Amna and I were king and queen,
me being king and him being queen.
Exactly. That's the chain of command. An educational approach, in contrast, would begin with a puzzle, right? So how is it that in these United States, a white mother can have a black baby, but a black mother can't have a white baby, right? The answer to this actually lies in the one-drop rule, which is the notion that any hint of African ancestry makes a person black, right? So we'd look at legislation, we'd look at court rulings and the census, we'd analyze how a distinctive racial hierarchy emerged in the United States with anti-black racism entrenched as a central feature of our politics, economy, and culture. You'd also delve into the fascinating history of whiteness, rather than simply taking it for granted as an identity category that transcends space and time. Before the 1940s, the Irish, Slavs, and Hebrews were seen as separate races, right? Markedly inferior in intellect and moral virtue to Anglo-Saxons and Scandinavians. How did all these people become white, right? And what of the different fissures within whiteness that have cropped up repeatedly across history, right? The lines of class, religion, and region have often divided white people internally. Thinking about white supremacy, you'd be asked to consider its many different forms, from plantation slavery to sharecropping, lynching, voting restrictions, and redlining in housing. You'd be asked to assess the meaning of white supremacy today, including how you would respond to scholars who reject this term on the ground that it racializes a lot of problems that a lot of people face, even when race is not the answer. By the way, in this recent anti-racism training that we experienced, one of the trainers said that any professor who was not on board with the mission to dismantle white supremacy, quote unquote, couldn't possibly be making a contribution to DEI work. This is odd, I think, for a number of reasons, but one reason is that it completely disregards the work of the many scholars across the political spectrum who have been skeptical of the utility of this term, white supremacy. From the left, the Black sociologist Adolph Reed Jr. has said that white supremacy is a reductionist, ahistorical model of the world, a fantasy of monolithic, unchanged, race-driven oppression that ignores the extent to which unequal life outcomes are arbitrated by class. On the right, economist Glenn C. Lowry of Brown University says that the term white supremacy, quote, is a bluff and a bludgeon that erases Black agency.
So another common feature of these trainings is trainings on microaggressions. As part of that, you'll be told that there's an intent and impact gap, and regardless of intent, certain statements or questions are offensive and must be avoided at all costs. So it's a one-size-fits-all kind of approach, and it erases the importance of context and encourages every interaction to be refracted through the prism of a singular identity, such as identity axis, such as race. So I'm going to show you an example of what these trainings look like when it comes to microaggressions.
By the way, I got in.
Oh my God, where?
Columbia.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
How'd you get into that school?
How did I get into that school? Does she think I'm not smart enough? And don't bring up affirmative action. I've earned this.
So the takeaway here is don't ever say anything like that. Now, I just want to be clear. It's not that we don't recognize that sometimes statements like, how did you get in or where do you come from can be said in a nasty tone or have a different kind of meaning. But the point is that context is key. And if you're teaching people a list of statements that are considered microaggressions and are being told that under no circumstances can those statements be uttered, then that's not education. That's a form of etiquette. It's like being taught which fork to use for which course of the meal. It tells you it doesn't tell you how to think, it just tells you what to think. And it thwarts the appreciation of context and encourages a literal mindedness that really does run counter to the whole mission of critical thinking that higher education is supposed to be equipping you with. So usually when we point this out to people, they're like, well, something needs to be done. And I agree, something needs to be done. We need to address DEI issues on our campus. But campus communities don't need diversity training about terms such as microaggressions, micro-invalidations, micro-insults. Instead, we should really be discussing thought-provoking works like, say, Claudia Rankine's book, Citizen, which is a personal account that strips the bare and everyday realities of racism. And rather than simply declaring that illegal immigrant is an unacceptable derogatory term, why not analyze Jason DeLeon's The Land of Open Graves, which is a vivid portrait that pushes our understanding of how lives are lived and lost on the US-Mexican border really to a new level. Oh,
By the way,
can you click to the next slide? So one example, I think one place that did it really well was the University of Pittsburgh. They actually designed an anti-Black racism course. And what they did was, this was a multidisciplinary course, and they got faculty on their own campus who could speak to the local context. They really capitalized on the expertise on campus instead of getting consultant trainers in. And they taught a course, and the three key root areas of this course, or the three main areas, were the roots, ideology, and resistance to anti-Black racism. And this is a far better educational model and far more sophisticated approach that behooves an intellectual institution to be undertaking.
I wanted to briefly touch on one other key administrative initiative or body that's a part of DEI Inc. as we see it, and that's what's called bias response teams. There are hundreds of colleges and universities across the country who now have these teams that are tasked with investigating and responding to complaints about so-called bias incidents. So if you're at the University of Central Florida, to report a bias incident, you click on a tab called Report Injustice. It brings you to this page where you identify yourself as the victim, a witness, a family member, a friend, spouse, or other. Next, you can fill in the requisite incident details, including the date, time, and location of the incident, as well as the type of incident, hold on, just leave that up for a second. The type of incident and the nature of the bias, which you see represented here. Yeah, space is provided to describe the incident in detail, and you can upload up to 3 attachments as evidentiary material. And finally, you can outline what you would like the desired outcome to be. So definitions of bias incidents vary by campus, but they have the following key features, right? They encompass verbal, written, or physical conduct directed towards an individual or group based upon actual or perceived identity characteristics, such as race, social class, and religion. Bias response teams frequently communicate to students that no incident is too small to report. That's a direct quote from the BERT at the University of Wisconsin Stout campus. Now, there are all sorts of egregious and entertaining complaints that you can read about in publicly available bias response logs if you're so interested. At University of California, Santa Cruz, a student complained that a faculty member made inappropriate jokes of grading like a Nazi and was reported. Also at UC Santa Cruz, a student complained that a single poster advertising a mafia game was, quote, extremely offensive to me as an Italian-American woman and could result in harassment of Italian-American students on campus. The poster, by the way, was duly removed. Our favorite complaint of all time, though, comes from the University of Michigan. And at the University of Michigan several years back, you got to look closely at this photograph, but a hall director reported a, quote, phallic snow object as a bias incident. Right. So BERTs purport to be educational initiatives, a claim they're at pains to highlight whenever they're subjected to criticism for being scolding panels. And yet the first major research study on bias response teams concluded that these teams devoted far more attention to punishing and condemning the perpetrators of specific acts than to community-wide education. And what effect does a BERT have on the general campus climate? Here's a student quoted from UC Santa Barbara. She said, "How are students supposed to feel empowered to share their honest opinions on social issues when they run the risk of being accused of undermining our culture of inclusivity?"
So now I'm going to move on to the last section. We're really going to talk about the discourse of harm that undergirds so much of what DEI Inc. is about, and how that discourse impinges on the freedom to teach and learn. So many of you probably know this by now, the Hamlin incident. Hamlin University here in Minnesota provides us the ideal case study for laying bare the unavoidable tensions between academic freedom and DEI Inc.'s approach to inclusion. This case made national and international headlines. I'm not going to go into the details, but just to jog your memory, here's a quick overview. Last fall semester, Erica Lopez Prater, who's an adjunct faculty member, art history professor, is teaching a global art history course. In her Islamic art history class, she showed a 14th century painting of Prophet Muhammad. She had warned students in her syllabus and had also announced it. This was an online class. So just before she actually showed the painting, she said, anyone who wants to turn their screen off can turn it off. And this was an optional exercise. A Muslim student, didn't turn their screen off, chose not to turn their screen off, saw the painting, got offended, complained to the DEI administration, and that set off a whole bureaucracy. And this is what she said. She said, as a Muslim and a Black person, I don't feel like I belong. I don't think I'll ever belong in a community where they don't value me as a member and they don't show me the same respect that I show them. So the DEI bureaucracy kicks into action. Associate Vice President for Inclusive Excellence makes a public statement calling the classroom exercise, and I'm quoting, undeniably inconsiderate, disrespectful, and Islamophobic. Then, because of this incident, he also goes on and says that it was decided it was best that this faculty member was no longer part of the Hamlin community. Her contract was not renewed. She was given no opportunity to explain herself in her class exercise. And then in December, the president and the DEI VP sent an open letter to the campus asserting that, and I'm quoting, appreciation of religious and other differences should supersede when we know that what we teach will cause harm. And in particular, respect for the observant Muslim students in that classroom should have superseded academic freedom, end of quote. So after this made national and international headlines, the president actually doubled down on her position, explaining that her decisions were guided by, and I'm quoting again, prioritizing the well-being of our students, especially by minimizing harm. So what happened then is that the professor sued Hamlin, and the president peddled back the claim that it was Islamophobic, and AAUP actually investigated Hamlin for this. The faculty has passed a vote of no confidence in the president, and the saga continues. I won't go into it. But the case really speaks for itself. It doesn't require much commentary. It shows how this flat discourse of harm undermines academic freedom and encroaches on pedagogical choices of faculty. You know, as a historian, it makes the teaching of history impossible because most of our primary sources, we're dealing with difficult things, and most of them include offensive language. So what am I going to do if someone's going to be offended by that? And before we think that this is just an issue that affects the humanities, it's not long before a Christian evangelical student will object to evolution being taught in class because it's against their religious principles. But the irony is that the DEI office, which is responsible and owns the charge for enhancing diversity and inclusion of minorities, was actually in this case responsible for flattening and erasing the diversity within the Muslim tradition and Muslim community. It's a fundamentally anti-intellectual approach towards diversity. So let me conclude. In conclusion, we would argue that DEI Inc. is in effect on most college campuses across the country, particularly elite college campuses. College leaders, by and large, have embraced it wholeheartedly. What could be more convenient from an administrative perspective than hiring diversity officers, implementing trainings, and rehearsing talking points, diversity talking points, likely generated by corporate consultants, or at this point, perhaps by ChatGPT even. The new DEI push, alas, is heavily informed by public relations, especially the optics of wanting to be seen to be doing the right thing. So in our view, this neoliberal approach of applying rubrics, metrics, and matrices sucks the lifeblood out of the kind of work that genuinely advances diversity and inclusion, reducing something that should be a rich and complex phenomenon to an anemic box-ticking exercise. Instead of generating genuine institutional change and intellectual curiosity, DEI Inc. merely generates more paperwork. Thank you.
I'm on.
You're on, Carlos.
Thank you. And Jeff, good seeing you. I must say, one of the things that Amna and Jeff and I met last fall, wasn't it? In September, when the new cohort of fellows of the National Institute for Free Speech and Civic Engagement met down in Irvine. And I was struck by and found someone who really agreed with me in the kinds of criticisms I had been making from the inside, but more in the criticism over the way the dialogue has been taking place within, I'll just say, academic institutions. And what we found even within the Institute fellows, there was an unwillingness of many of them to say there are some basic conflicts between concepts of diversity, inclusion, equity, and issues of academic freedom and free speech. And they simply wouldn't say, oh no, they're compatible. They're compatible. And books have been written about how perfectly compatible they are. And I've been arguing, no, there are some basic sources of tension that have to be dealt with. And along came Jeff and Amanda, and they said, well, we're with you. Which doesn't mean that I agree with them on everything. In fact, we write to each other, we criticize each other even before we met today. I wrote them, I said, I'm not going to comment on anything you've written. I'm going to only respond to what you say today because I want the most recent Jeff and Amna show that I can respond to. But I also see it there, that guy's, looks like Steve Brent rubbing his chin. Yeah, thanks, Steve. So I'm going to steal from you, Steve. And so in contrast to them, I'm going to take the title of your book and say, 2 cheers for DEI, not Inc., which I deny, but 2 cheers for DEI, but a big gap of that 3rd cheer And I think Jeff and Amna laid out why I won't give that third chair. Precisely because most of the criticisms they laid down, I agree with. But there's something bigger. You had an experience on diversity training, and you said diversity training doesn't work, and you showed it all that. I've been doing diversity training for 50 years. I have never done any of the things that you demonstrated. Not one. And I have actually written, I write a column on diversity in speech in the American Diversity Report, in which I level some of the very same criticisms that they do. So, yeah, that's bad training. But that doesn't mean diversity training is bad. It just means that I look here and I see a historian there, a philosopher, and I say, people, you've had bad teachers of philosophy and bad teachers of history and all that, and really bad teaching goes on even at UCR and all of our disciplines, but that doesn't throw out the discipline. So I'm going to argue that, in fact, diversity training, when done well, when done right, when not a downloaded, I would say the criticism that was made of diversity training is more a criticism of the industrial model of diversity training, the downloaded trainer of trainers, institutional model, in which people who don't know squat about the topic get up and talk about it because they downloaded the right slides and gone through a 2-hour training program on how to teach about these topics. And it's awful. I work now as part-time in the School of Medicine as co-director of the Health Equity, Social Justice, and Anti-Racism curriculum, all the buzzwords put together, okay? Part of what I've been doing for the last 3 years since I took this new position is going to trainings in medical school, medical national trainings, including trainings on microaggressions. Some of them are excellent. Some of them are exactly what Jeff and I said. Downloaded, don't say, you know, oh my God, don't ask someone where they're from, they might be offended and all that. And yet some of them actually talk about address the way that people relate to each other, basing it on neuroscientific principles, using cross-cultural examples. They're actually, I even though I have been teaching about microaggressions for years, I've been learning something from some of them, and yet I find myself appalled by some of the other trainings. So what happens is there's a bigger picture here, and the big picture is this, and working on my book, which I'm tentatively calling the diversity versus speech versus diversity, diversity versus speech. I'm doing what I'm doing just let's put it on, game on. Let's see what happens when these things collide. Then what you find is that there is not a diversity. There may be a DEI Inc, so we'll come back to that. But there is not a coherent thing called diversity. There is a thing I call the diversity movement. But what happens is it's actually 5 different strands sort of struggling with each other. In fact, I'll just read the current way I define it. The diversity movement is the composite of disparate efforts since the late 1960s to make progress toward eliminating inequities among individuals and groups. And it's kind of long-winded, but it's not centralized. There is no founding document. There is no single national diversity organization. So sitting down, it's command and control. It is chaos. And it's a good, healthy chaos because lots of moving parts are out there. But what you find is there are sort of 5 strands. I'm going to connect these to what Jeff and Amna said. First is the intercultural strand. Now, this started in the 1920s and built up, which essentially is the idea that started on an international level, which is people should learn about other people, because if you learn about other cultures and different ways of doing things, connect with them better across the lines when you travel. And then said, oh, why companies can make money by doing this. But it's all based on the principle that you learn about other people because you want to get along with other people. And the more that you understand where they're coming from, you're better off. It's sort of the basic intercultural principle. And then what happened this was mainly international, and when the civil rights movement and then the early diversity movement in the 1970s came along, the interculturalists said, we're sort of out of luck. We're behind time. Someone else is taking over from us. And they sort of pivoted into sort of the national realm and got involved in diversity stuff. So we'll leave it at that. I was involved in it because I was on the faculty of the Summer Institute for Intercultural Communication, which I taught for 2 decades, with classes that ran for a week or so. Currently up in Oregon, and it was. But the principle was, you ought to self-regulate yourself, not by injunctions, not by commands, not by microaggression lists. But you want to think about courtesy. And to be courteous, to know about other people is a good way to be courteous interculturally. That was sort of the thing. In fact, what you want to do is self-edit yourself. And this is why all this stuff about self-censorship. There's nothing, in fact, the chapter in my book I'm calling In Praise of Self-Censorship. I think self-censorship is damn good of language. But not self-censorship of ideas, not self-censorship of inquiry, not self-censorship of seeking stuff, but to step back and say, hey, it doesn't hurt for me to be courteous with another human being by restricting some of the things I might otherwise say. I don't find this anything deplorable at all. Well, although I do agree with Jeff, I don't want some entities coming down and telling me this is what you got to do. And then along out of the civil rights movement came what I call the ethnic inclusion, equity and inclusion dimension of this whole thing. We had it at UCR. I was here when we established Chicano Studies and Black Studies. I was the founder of Chicano student programs on this campus. It was founded by accident because when I was asked to take over a chair of Chicano Studies, and all hell, everything was being dumped, like the person up at Hammond, anything was going wrong related to Chicanos got dumped on the chair of the Chicano Studies academic program. And when they asked me to take over, I said, I won't take over unless you set up a separate unit, which is Chicano Student Programs. It's now finished its 50th year, celebrated last year. Big thing in the UCR magazine. Is that part of DEI Inc? Because they put on student programs, they bring kids to campus, they should recruit them, do all kinds of programming. Right now, the Rivera Conference is taking place in the room right over here, and which looking at Chicano literature, which wasn't taking place when I got here. There was an explosion of equity and inclusion stuff before the term equity and inclusion ever were used. When we started the 1970s, nobody was talking about diversity. By the end of the 1970s, everybody was talking about diversity. It was there. And so you have all kinds of things taking place. I was involved in lots of them. And I wrote to Jeff and Emma, I'm going to be listening to your description of DEI Inc. to see, and I told them, I'm going to be testing myself. Am I a member of DEI Inc., a card-carrying member? I just didn't know it. And I've been basically listening to you. I'm probably not, but maybe I'll let them decide yet. Then along came in the 1980s a guy named R. Roosevelt Thomas who came with the concept of managing diversity. And that's, I think, where the complication started. And when he was working with private businesses, he said, look, diversity is a good thing. In fact, if we can build what today we call inclusive excellence, we can bring people together and get them into industry, and you'll get better workers, and you'll be able to market stuff and sell more product, and we will manage diversity. Everybody's win-win, win for minorities, win for women, win for, well, it wasn't win for transgenders. Nobody was talking about transgenders there, but win for all kinds of people, and you make money too, and we can manage it. But what happened is universities adopted an industrial management format for looking at how they approach diversity. We're going to manage diversity. So what you get in what you call DEI is really an adaptation of an industrial model, including the training approaches used by industry in diversity, which are not intended to improve diversity. They're risk management. They're risk management so they can say, if they get a lawsuit about sexual harassment. Well, we put everybody through sexual harassment training. We got people in this room. I'm part-time now. I have had to take, I think, 6 or 7 different online training programs. You have to. Sometimes they're very good, they're very efficient, they're very quick. As orientation, you'll learn about the ethics of secrecy, how to guard secrecy in your files and all that sort of thing. You take them, you answer the questions, you get a check mark. 5 minutes later, you've forgotten everything you've learned, but it's neat that everything's been checked. That's crap. It's orientation. It sort of orients you to what the topic is. So diversity orientation works. Diversity training, the way that and Jeff had laid out, doesn't work. What's even worse, you didn't touch on it, is online diversity training. I was asked by the biomedical sciences here to join their anti-racism task force, but I couldn't be a part of it. One of the requirements is you have to take the UCR implicit bias training. It's 4 hours or something like that. And I said, no, I don't believe it. And second, but I'll do it, but I'll only do it until I come across something that I think is crap. And at which point I'm going to stop. I wasn't 10 minutes into the program. And I went back to the committee and I said, I'm not going to go. I'm not going to do it. And they said, well, you have to be part of the committee, the task force. I said, but don't be on the task force. Well, we want you on the task force. Okay, then you're going to join. And just to me, I'm not going to take your damn training because it was bad. So I think it's more the stuff that you're talking about in those groups. You missed the whole point, which is the industrialized online diversity training, which at worst doesn't do much good. At best doesn't do much good. And I think it can cause harm. However, I've worked with diversity training artists, and they are damn good. I've worked with the Emotional Intelligence and Diversity Institute in LA, which does intensive for diversity training. 3 people with maybe a dozen people they're working on, 1 week put together, really addressing things. People come out the other side having learned a lot, having changed their behavior and thinking, that's good diversity training. So I reject your idea that diversity training is bad. I don't reject your idea that this industrial model diversity training is bad. So I don't know if we agree or not. So I'm going to throw it there. But that's what happened then. This is, we're still operating in that industrial model. Which doesn't mean that DEI is bad if the model is warped. In fact, we might say the whole university management model is warped. That goes to a different thing. And then we can get 2 final things to jump in on here. Just to find 2 final threads of the diversity movement. One was critical theory, not critical race theory, critical theory, but that goes back to Germany in the 1920s. It's got long roots. Critical theory. We've got courses on queer theory here. We've got courses on feminist theory. We got lots of critical theory going on in campus, including critical race theory and critical theory. But the thing that made it substantive, all of it, is distrust of institutions, distrust of historical practices, distrust of, in fact, even distrust of some of the stuff going on in managing diversity, distrust in academic freedom, distrust in freedom of speech, looking upon almost everything as potentially restricting the advancement of oppressed, marginalized, name whatever people you want. So you got this thing that began to plow in the 1980s, alongside another thread, which was suddenly the rise of the therapeutic model. PTSD was discovered in 1980. That's something when the National Institute of Psychiatry said, oh, there's a thing called trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, a real thing, okay? But what's happened is that the PTSD model, the therapeutic model, the harm model, as you might call it, has suddenly spread and has become, I think, a actually poisonous wing of the diversity movement, which makes me an outsider, who's very pro-diversity training, but very opposed to these sort of authoritarian, harm-centered models, but yet recognizing that harm does occur. Saying we don't want a harm-centered DEI ignores the question, people may be harmed. Now, I just came 2 hours ago. I taught a 2-hour class over the medical school. Dr. Mario Sims spoke. He's done his research on health disparities. There's tons of research on health disparities now. And one of the things he's a specialist in cardiovascular health. And one of the things they have concluded, and I'm not going to guarantee the quality of the research, I haven't read it, probably couldn't understand it if I did read it, is the fact that language, including ethnic slurs and racial slurs, increases Black heart attacks. They've got evidence presenting it. So it's just words. Oh, no. For some people, it's life and death. And to just say, oh, it's just words over here, or we need more speech, this inane, all-purpose fool's gold solution for all things speech. I'm for more speech. I'm for much greater inquiry. I'm not going to look on more speech as the antidote, a perfect antidote for everything, because it's killing people. And to deny, as the AAUP does, and by the way, and I looked it up yesterday, AAUP document, we oppose abuse. They don't support all freedom of speech, or academic freedom. They say we oppose abuse. It's on their thing on freedom of expression. They oppose abusive behavior, but say that ethnic, sexist, or homophobic slurs and express ideas. They're not abusive, folks. They're not abusive behavior. I've gone to diversity meetings. I present this. They look at me and they say, "Are you out of your mind? Are you inane?" Here's an organization, which is the lead organization on academic freedom, says we're opposed to abusive behavior. Oh, but ethnic, sexist, and homophobic and racial slurs, those aren't abusive behavior. And the critical theorists look at organizations like the AAUP and say, this is nonsense. This is double talk. So I sit back and I say, wait a second. I'm glad the fact that people like Em and Jeff, like we sit down and talk about these things. How do we pull this together? How do we get off this dancing around words, claiming to be one thing and not being, and getting people together? And I get back to the questions. I'll let you answer, but my friends, am I part of DEI Inc? Am I an opponent of DEI Inc? Am I a card-carrying member? I don't know. But I'm not opposed to DEI, because I see DEI, and I've worked with DEI people all across the country. I've worked in 350 universities in the United States. And I found lots of DEI people not doing the kinds of things that Jeff and Ann show, doing all kinds of good stuff. Helpful campus, bringing people together on intercultural principles. So I'm going to say 2 cheers for DEI, but I'm not going to say that 3rd cheer because I'll leave that for DEI.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to, I think we have about a half an hour. I'd like to have a lively conversation. I'm also going to pull rank and say the first thing before I give it to other people. This is mostly a comment, but it's meant to be a little bit provocative, which is, I wrote down a few of the things that Carlos said that I completely agreed with. This idea of, self-regulation, learning to get along. There's all this sort of, an ethos that I completely agree with. I guess what I find to be way more often than not the case, including at UCR, this actual institution, is that the models for DEI, Inc. or not, seem to de-emphasize ideas like resiliency, psychological strength, grace. I mean, when I can guarantee there's the word grace doesn't exist once in any DEI language model. I just took the campus anti-discrimination training. I was mortified. The entire thing was about wearing a chip on your shoulder, assuming the worst possible intention on whoever you're communicating with, and basically taking offense, and never about how might I deal with difficult people in the world, because there are difficult people in the world. And that is the entire wing of this that I think is missing. And I'm for all the things you said, but I'm also think that that's become, the model is, how do we treat people as victims? How do we not become resilient human beings in a complicated world? So that's what I'm going to throw out there. And then
I think when I do teach microaggressions, resilience is a key part of it.
great.
In fact, I teach microaggression, and when I did, is that in fact, conversations are mutual responsibilities, including exactly what you're talking about.
So in that entire model, where does UCR fall on this?
I'm so glad I'm retired. I'm just dealing with it. It's just enough in the medical school. That's fine. I don't know. I haven't investigated, man. I get computer and my other friends here know more about UCR than I do.
So I don't want to cut this off, but I will do something absolutely impossible with me trying to be brief. One, please, is thank you. One is that this is the second time in my 30-some years at UCR where I have absolutely agreed with everything the three of you have said. So thank you very much.
That's dangerous.
No. The second is, Carlos, this will sound like I'm contradicting myself, but I'm not. You repeated in your outstanding presentation, enlightening, you repeated the phrase, seeing a bigger picture. Now, I see a slightly different, bigger picture from the side, not disagreeing with yours, but there are many different pictures. This conversation has finally helped me understand the meaning of Gresham's law, except as applied to human practice, not coinage. That easier, more bureaucratized, more routinized, more replicable in terms of numbers and metrics. In other words, worst practices, given a complex problem to be confronted, are likely with a high degree of probability to displace better practices. Carlos, you have pled for better practices, and I would like to know where they are. Thank you. Great. I would not, because I'm going to shut up in a minute, but the common denominator here is something I've always agreed with. We have an enormous issue related to values on which I think we all agree. The trouble comes with policies implemented to attain those values, and whether we call it Inc. or industrial, which to me is exactly the same thing, Carlos, it is decades of underinvesting in good education in general and allowing all kinds of people to do the easy thing, which is to measure, not think, and coerce.
And by the way, I only just throw in a reaction. I get invited often by entities and say, we'd like you to come in and do diversity training. And I say, how much time, how many people, and time, what can you accomplish? I tell them this, I always say, do you do pre and post tests? I say, never. I said, I don't do a damn thing. All they do is measure some short-term thing that 15 minutes later is going to be all done. And it speaks exactly. I can take people from A to B. We have enough time. We can do it. Don't give me a pre and post. But this organization over here said they could come in. They got pre and post tests. I said, and they're cheaper than you. I said, hire them. Hire them. If that's what you want that industrial approach to education. I said, what you're talking about? You're talking about education. Diversity training should be diversity education and should be as well based, which an industrial model does not permit. I agree.
Steve Brent has one.
Okay, can you unmute? Steve, I think we're on.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks.
Well, thank you for all three of you for a very interesting discussion so far. Look, I wanted to just make 2 points. One is, I think there's an empirical question about what Carlos has previously called disinfecting types of diversity, where you're trying to purify the environment. And the question is, how much of what we see in DEI in universities now is of this disinfecting type? And if there's something, what is it that is leading us to, if there is a lot of that, which my suspicion is that there is, what is creating that and preventing the good forms of DEI that Carlos is talking about? Second point, and Amna and Jeffrey have also been down in Florida as I have. One thing that really struck me is something that they said is that this language of harm is really taken off on the right. And so a lot of the legislation in Florida is, our kids cannot stand to hear anything divisive about American history or about race, and therefore we can't do it. And so the whole therapeutic idea, which I think is psychologically dubious, but certainly politically at this point is very dubious, that's become embedded as much in the right as it is in the left. So those are my 2 comments. Thank you.
Why don't you guys take it?
Okay, great. Thanks, Steve. It's good to see you. I'll take the first one, and I think Jeff will take the second one. I think the question of what is driving this kind of approach, DEI approach on college campuses, I think it's the bigger picture of the corporatization of higher education, which has led to A, administrative bloat, and B, it's not just about the bloat. It's like administrators think of things in a different way. It's a whole different way to solve a problem. It's a short-term solution. It's check the box. They need to get it done. And I appreciate that they have imperatives and pressures on them. However, that kind of approach cannot dominate the mission of higher education, which is education. And the administrative approach should be subordinate, I think, to the main mission of what we do. So I think a lot of this kind of approach of let's just get it done, and it's a PR issue, is being driven by the dominance of the administrative model of thinking that has come to be on college campuses, and it is highly corporatized, even with on public campuses.
Yeah, when Carlos was talking about the diversity movement of the 1970s, that of course overlaps with civil rights and women's rights and gay rights, the term that you used, Carlos, right, is that it's messy, and of course it is. And one of the things that I think is problematic about this DEI Inc. approach is the basic premises that it makes about a multicultural, diverse society. I think one of the premises, either explicitly spelled out or implicit in DEI Inc., is that one can come together, recognize and celebrate differences, right? That diversity kind of has this additive effect, and that it's mostly going to be easygoing once we get into a room and we start talking to one another. But I think we have to start with the premise that living in a diverse multicultural society, the baseline is friction, right? To me, the iconic example of this is Spike Lee's 1989 film, Do the Right Thing. Look what happens when we live together in urban spaces with people from all over the world, speaking different languages, having different religious traditions. That's hard. And so what I think happens with DEI Inc. is that especially administrators, they want to avoid the messiness, right? The difficulties of real diversity. When you have students from all over the world, as you do at Carleton, we should start with the working assumption that there's going to be conflict. You got contact, you're going to have conflict. I also just briefly wanted to say that to this question of self-censorship is very interesting to me. And so I asked, recently I asked a group of my students, to what extent is self-censorship an issue? And I agree with Carlos that self-censorship is often a positive. It's not universally negative. I got a bad haircut the other day and Amna didn't say, oh my God, you look awful. She had the tact to self-censor.
Actually, I didn't self-censor.
Right. But it's a problem when that prevents us from harnessing the incredible transformative power of diversity that is in our midst. So the example that I want to give is I had a student, I asked, do you feel the pressures of self-censorship on campus? I had a student from Morocco, junior, third year. He said, I don't look like I'm from the United States. I kind of look foreign, quote unquote, his words. I speak with an accent. Nobody asks me where I'm from because they're so afraid of committing a microaggression. He said, I'm from Morocco and all I want to do on this campus is share information about my cultural background and have a conversation with people like, what's Morocco like? Right. And so DEI Inc. puts us in this curious position where you've got students from every country in the world, but his impression was, he said, nobody's ever asked me where I'm from. And that to me is the starting point, right? So that was a couple points rolled up into one, but I do think they're related.
Well, you haven't addressed the right and psychology of harm. Okay, well, I'll go to that, but building on what Jeff just said, I think one of the things is the way in which we have kind of put civility on this ridiculous pedestal, where civility is required all the time. And I'm not arguing for incivility, but I am saying, I just want to make a plug here for Teresa Bejan's, I hope I'm pronouncing it right, her new book, Mere Civility, which makes us rethink what the default of a multicultural society ought to be and what we need to think about civility. It's not more civility, it's mere civility. I'm simplifying the argument, but that's the crux of it. And I think that's a really important intervention to be made right now as we're trying to figure out what it means to live in a pluralistic society, and particularly on a campus that has people from everywhere. And the question of harm that you asked, Steve, I couldn't agree more. I think Jeff and I have been kind of banging our heads against a wall. That's what it felt like, that this kind of language of harm for a long time, like this is not helpful, because all you need to think is 2 steps ahead and you know who else is going to use it.
So sorry to interrupt you. You are the king. I don't know what I'm doing here. I'm upsetting royal protocol, but I'm a Gen Xer, and there was a song in the 1990s that came out by REM, and it was called Everybody Hurts. And so if you have this discourse of harm, everybody can use it. And so, Stephen, in response to your question, it made me think of, I was talking about biased response teams earlier, right? And there's to me an absolutely outrageous example that comes from John Carroll University, where white students complained that a Black Lives Matter protest had made them feel uncomfortable. Now, if we live in a world where the administrators have to take that seriously, which they did, like we've truly gone through the looking glass.
Also, just the bigger picture and the corporatization of higher ed that I was talking about. It's interesting to me that the number of administrative positions that are proliferating on campus to deal with these problems, right? These problems, which frankly are generated by slogans like nothing is too small to report. Well, now we have people reporting. We have to deal with it. What can we do? We need to hire someone else. Meanwhile, faculty lines are being cut. Adjunctification of faculty is happening. Like, why don't you just run the whole university system with administrators? And that's my problem with Diversity Inc. They're encroaching on what is our territory, and rightly so our territory. This is not, this is not a situation where one's just being protective of one's turf. But the fact of the matter is that we deal with these things with great intellectual sophistication. Now, when you bring in a consultant from outside, not Carlos, I have immense respect for, and I think the way he's talking about diversity is actually the good way to do, that's the way to do these things. But when you bring in these kind of checklists and have consultants administer them, then you really are undermining a faculty co-governance, because I can't imagine faculty getting, well, some maybe, but I can't imagine a vast majority of faculty getting on board with this. And the second thing you're undermining is the mission of higher ed, which is critical thinking. And now lots of people have their hands up, so I should shut up.
Okay, I'm going to bring one. Go ahead, Lisa. We're going to do a live question and then What's your name?
First of all, thank you very much. There's so much here to agree with. I'd like to bring in to the discussion, however, the notion that corporations are legally people. So if you had, say, let's say a bad departmental chair doing all the harm that DEI Inc. has been doing on campus X, there would be many ways to get rid of this. And the question is, can we use the same DEI apparatus to reflect back on the role of DEI itself? Because I'm trying to think about what we can actually do about the situation, given that it's being run by administrations and corporations. Is there any way, as it were, to use the same logic to complain about the discomfort and harm done by DEI using its own procedures?
Well, let me just, in order to make headway, an alternative vision of a positive, constructive approach to diversity has to be proffered. That's the only way. If you just criticize, nothing is going to happen, because in fact, people who are, let's forget the DEI, all the other folks on this campus who are supportive of DEI efforts will support them and look at you as simply a bunch of aging, I don't want to be racist, white people defending their white prerogatives. The critical theorists say, "We told you so." Look what happened. Hey, look, you've gone into the national, what's it, the National Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Education. I Googled them yesterday and I went on to see what images they had. Take a look at that picture. Take a look at this picture. Okay, almost entirely Black people, almost entirely. I don't want to stereotype, but I look at you, you're probably pretty, you look pretty white, sort of like me. So if you're going to walk in to criticize, come in with ideas to advance diversity, to go along with the criticism. If you don't, you're be written off, and you ought to be written off as simply complainers. So, I'm hoping that CIVIC will come up with something. That's one of the reasons I joined. That might. I'm not confident it will, but I'm glad bringing in people like Anna and Jeff. I think folks to spur this. Yeah, maybe you have a shot at it.
To your point earlier, Carlos, about where academic departments like Chicano Studies, Women's and Gender Studies, Africana Studies would, in our view, would they fit under the DEI Inc. umbrella? My answer would be an emphatic no. And I think part of what we need to do as faculty to diversify the space that's dedicated to these issues, whether it's critiques of standard DEI initiatives or discussions of academic freedom and free speech, these spaces definitely are not the most racially diverse spaces that I've been in. And I think that's up to the people who are in those spaces already to invite in their colleagues, right? So to me, I would not object to it wouldn't be a training, but some sort of educational event done by my colleagues in Africana Studies on the history of the transatlantic slave trade, for example. So I think, at least to my mind, I make a strong distinction between kind of the fields that have grown out of academe, right, departments. And I think they're doing enormously valuable work. The scholarship is often path-breaking, hugely significant. But that to me is a very different model than looking to administrators.
Brian, Paul, I think you're up.
Very good. Thank you very much. Very scintillating conversation. Hello, Amna, Jeff, Carlos, pleasure to be here. I am a political communication scholar by training, and I can't help but think about the politicization of diversity, inclusion, equity, and free speech. I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on the origins, or what you would see as the key origins of that politicization of these values, these principles. And in your estimation, is it possible to remove the politics at all from these seemingly universal principles, ideals values, obviously in legislation and in other attempts to address DEI Inc. and reinforce free speech. This is becoming very political, not least of which in states like Florida and elsewhere. So what would you say are the origins of this politicization? Is it possible for us to remove politics at all from this? And if so, how can that be done effectively?
I have some thoughts, but do you want to go?
Well, just really briefly, I mean, I don't think that these are the true origins, but are a key, pivotal moment was, Trump politicized everything. And in the Trump era, I think that the very idea of free speech very unfortunately became branded as a right-wing issue or cause. And that's due to the likes of right-wing trolls like Milo Yiannopoulos and Ann Coulter, right, who engaged in this kind of, who masqueraded as free speech martyrs, right, going onto college campuses to whip up controversy, drape themselves in the mantle of free speech. And a lot of our students who don't have any other understanding of the history of free speech, quite understandably associate that term with really extreme conservative speakers who aren't engaging in good faith. So I think that kind of 2-year period did enormous damage just to free speech as a brand, for lack of a better word.
And shame on those of us, shame on us who let this happen, right? Like who gave up on free speech as a value and let it be coded as a partisan value. So I do think that, part of the blame is that we weren't willing to criticize ourselves and see what's happening within the academy. Even now when we criticize like DEI Inc., everyone's like, oh, well, you're supporting Ron DeSantis and look at what you're saying. And this is not the time. And I'm like, this is exactly the time. We've come to this point precisely because we have been unwilling to contend with the fact that there are issues and we need to deal with them. And now we've handed it to people on the extremes, both extremes, to make a political football out of what is, frankly, the mission of higher education. The whole higher education has become a political football. Education in general, public education. But you had a second question, which is how do we get past this? And what is the way, I think it's a slow process, but I think one of the ways to start is to start educating people about how these binaries that are being constructed are so facile and that they're not grounded. So one of the things that I've decided to do is to teach the global history of free speech as a course, right? Because students think this is helping white supremacists and people who are oppressing. And I'm like, no, hang on. One, this is a value that has allowed minorities to come to the fore. And two, this isn't a white supremacist value or part of white culture. This has a much longer, richer history. But it's the ignorance of history and it's the ignorance of engaging with a wider world that we are suffering from in the US right now, especially in higher ed as well, sadly. And I do feel that American exceptionalism has turned into an American isolationism, which is turning, the root is towards stupidity. And we're seeing it happen. And it's a tragedy for the likes of us who have, or me, who have moved halfway across the world to actually enjoy the freedom to think, to see I am landing in a place where everyone is veering towards stupid. Sorry.
She thought she was entering the promised land and then she met me. That was, it's a real letdown.
That's a separate story.
Any other people from our group want to speak? Okay, anybody else from who's next there? Wait.
There's no other hands.
One at a time. Who else?
No one has their hand raised right now.
No one has any question on Zoom?
It was just a thank you.
Okay, go ahead.
I just want to echo the drift toward the stupid. I just think it's absolutely the right diagnosis. Thank you.
Some time, take some questions.
Let me.
Oh, there we
go. I didn't want to interrupt. I wanted you guys to go first. I always think back to what Eric Hoffer wrote. He says, I wrote it down, mass movements can rise and spread without belief in a God, but never without belief in a devil. And I think the demonizing, and I gotta be honest, I think you demonized with your DEI Inc. And I'll just say to you as a friend, I don't think DEI Inc. label is a constructive label because it's a demonizing label. And if you can take it and say, when we say this, we are referring to this. It makes sense. But even as you talk today, there was creep. There was concept creep, and suddenly you were talking about diversity. Diversity training is not DEI. It's a huge enterprise of all kinds of people doing great stuff and awful stuff. And to demonize it as simply a product of DEI is to polarize in a way I don't think you need to do. So I think you can be very critical without demonizing. Because once you inject demons, boy, conversations can't happen.
I think Marisol had a question.
We're gonna take this question.
Hello, how are you? This is Marisol. I'm a faculty at Michigan State University, and the conversation has been excellent. Thank you very much. What I wanted to say is, and I haven't heard this point being made yet, and to me, this is the number one most important thing about DEI, is that it's being used as an ideological litmus test. I have applied for several jobs in universities, and they have DEI statements, and we know that they had statements that are being used for selecting candidates. Oh yes, there was used an example in University of California of selecting candidates through DEI statements. Different candidates that I've chosen to hire have had to go through the approval of DEI committees and MSU in order for me to move forward with, interviewing or candidates that I've had for my small positions, let's say like graduate students or technician or whatever. Some DEI statements are being used are being required for tenure and promotion. I have refused to fill it because I know they're being used as ideological litmus tests, and I don't agree with many of the values of DEI or the assumptions of DEI as it's being taught right now. And the requirement finally got removed, at least at my college. I was not required to fill it. That was a battle. But I believe in many of these cases, they're being used for ideological discrimination, and some cases for race and sex discrimination. I have heard clearly people say, white men, we want to get rid of them in academia, and such statements. So yes, they're being used as race discrimination, sex discrimination, and ideological discrimination. So I guess that's it for what I have to say. So thank you very much for letting me speak.
Thank you. We have a question from the audience.
A quick note on whether or not DEI Inc. is demonizing or not. I came to this session never having heard the term before, and listening to audio was very impressed. And Carlos, I didn't see it as demonizing so much as analyzing. This is a lens through which to see. But I want to ask a question before you answer that. My question is that the word training implies that there's a trainer and a trainee, and that the trainer is somehow higher. And I've seen several problems on our campuses where the trainer has not been as broadly humanistically informed as Carlos rightly says we should be. All of us have said this. So my question is, what should we do when we're approached by a trainer who is not as humanistically sensitive to the range of issues as the trainee is? What should the trainee do?
I mean, this is a really difficult question to answer. And, as people who've been subjected is the right word, to hours and hours of absolutely just nonsensical training, it does make it very difficult, because what do you say to the trainer? But the problem is that this is not a personal attack on anyone. It is not an attack on the kind of critique is of a particular kind of mode of thinking that assumes that somehow we can check all these boxes and we can have this happy clappy diversity without any kind of friction. So to be honest, I'm not really sure what one says to the trainer at that moment in the room, but I think there's something to be said to those who are requiring you to take that training and bringing the trainers in and saying, pushing back and saying, look, this is not what we're signing up for. We want to do our own kind of campus stuff where we we capitalize on the expertise of our own faculty? Let's have sessions. Let's have programming through the year to talk about these issues in a way that behooves an intellectual institution. But let's not do this. Let's not bring in this kind of corporate type of training, which undermines everything. There's one more point I wanted to make, but I've forgotten, but you can come in meanwhile.
Well, I mean, I'd like to hear from Carlos on this. I think one of the issues that we have had with training as we have experienced it, and I take Carlos's point and am listening to him very, very carefully, in that, you know, there may be an element of exaggeration or caricature in the DEI Inc. Model that we've sketched out, because we have only experienced a particular slice of it. And maybe it makes more sense as being part of the industrial model that Carlos described. But I think what I find most frustrating from an academic and intellectual perspective about training, and this relates to the comments made by the woman about mandatory diversity statements, is that there are right and wrong answers to social problems. Right. And so I'd be curious to hear Carlos reflect on that, because there's a difference between, if you take my class on the history of American education, you can't possibly come out not recognizing that there's deep racial inequality embedded in the public education system in the United States. But the question of what do we do about that, that's an open question with lots of potential avenues. And I'm not sure I know which one is the most promising. I know we're running out of time, but Carlos, I'd be curious to hear your take on that.
Well, you know, let me build on that, because one of the things over the last 5 years, let's just say, they call equity language lists. They're being published all over the place. Medical schools have them too. Now, there's an old saying, there's a difference between taking a problem seriously and taking a solution seriously. The equity language list point to some real breakdowns in inequities within the language. That's not to be dismissed. But then you go into the other column but here's the right word.
Mm-hmm.
And then you get this authoritarian list that just curdles your brain.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to fight against that. And so we have to battle. I think the enemy is orthodoxy, no matter where it comes from. And within the industrial model we got to have the list of, if we got a list of bad words, we have to come up with a list of right words. And then the trainers come in, do exactly what you're talking about. And worse yet, these trainers are products of a thing we call trainer of trainers. It's a model that industry has, which is a trainer that gets a group of trainers for 3 hours and trains them and sends them out to teach you with a PhD about something you know more than they know. You're absolutely right. And we got to push back. But not push back just criticizing, push back by providing better options. And that's what I don't see coming out of academics who are critical about DEI. They're not coming up with good options, alternative options.
We had one more question or point of observation from Denise. She said,
okay, so I'm gonna ask Denise to make maybe perhaps her last question. I just want to say something quickly, which is that, you know, I'm an artist, but my father was a scientist, and I learned the scientific method very young. I'm fine with all these things about some diversity trainings work and some don't. I need to see the evidence. So far, I've seen zilch as far as substantial evidence that any of the best intention trainings actually what's the make people less racist? I'm not really even sure what the goal is, but whatever it is, if you show me some sort of track record of evidence that these things can work, then let's see it.
I will just say for these 30 years, as I work with entities, they say, we want to see if it works. I go and I say, I would like to see if what I'm doing works. I have not found one organization, academic or non-academic, who's willing to put in the money to do the research to find out if it works.
Why that would be.
So is there proof that diversity training works? No, but it's not that diversity training doesn't work. There's no proof that it doesn't work.
Well, there is some, sorry, Carlos, there is some proof that the kind of diversity training that we've been talking about doesn't work from the works of Dobbin and Califf.
But I'll repeat what I said. It doesn't prove that diversity training doesn't work. It proves that the industrial model diversity
Yes,
training
yes.
they were looking upon doesn't.
Point taken, yeah.
Denise, please, sorry you had to wait so long.
I can't get organizations. I have talked to psychologists on our campus.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
How can we devise a study to test to see if it works? I can't get even any scholars on this campus to be willing to do that. Surprise.
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Okay, sorry. I'm out on my porch right now, so you may hear some ambient spring noises. So thank you for the conversation. Very interesting, informative, and shed some light on many things for me. I am a diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism consultant. I am one of those folks who has a doctorate and the like, earning a doctorate, writing my dissertation now with data collection around this topic, which is how do people learn and unlearn racial identity development from an organizational development perspective. The work that I do is really around helping people own their parts in their roles and really helping them build their capacity from a sort of grounded theory. Who are you? What impact do you want to have? Rather than a sort of, as Paulo Freire would call it, sort of banking model of education, which I think is the critique that is being offered here about general DEI training. There are a couple things I would like to note if you would give me a moment to build to it. To the question about does DEI training work to decrease racism. I think that some trainings are better than others. And I think the DEI community needs to revisit, I think those individuals who develop those trainings need to revisit the ultimate goal that they want to have. I think we need to recognize the fact that in the United States, race and racism and having open discussion about it is a competence that we do not develop within our homes, within our churches, within our schools, and even within our peer groups. Learn how to communicate and debate things in a reasoned, logical, non-emotional way. And I think when we look at the history of the United States, where race and racism is concerned, particularly regarding multi-generational Black Americans, I'm 7th generation American descendant of US slaves, what we do recognize that even in 1964, with the passage of the Civil Rights Act, only 59% of Americans agreed with the Civil Rights Act, 31% disagreed, and 10% weren't sure. This is 1964. This is after seeing all of the things that were happening on your television, hearing them all on your radio. So the idea that a DEI training is suddenly going to make 100% of Americans not anti-Black racist or anti-whatever, I think is an expectation that is unfair, I think illogical, and is not taken into account historical context. I don't think you need a research study necessarily about if DEI trainings are effective. I think what you need to probably do is all people who train need to have post-event assessments and evaluation of the impact that they are having in the moment and how people continue to use that work. This is not a one-off training to accomplish this. This is self-identity, self-development, competency development that takes some time. The other point that I'd like to make is in regard to the resilience comment that was made. And this is the comment, this is why I put the comment in the chat box. To expect American Negroes to continually tolerate, coach, cajole new Americans and even resistant longstanding Americans to believe in the necessity of engaging in this type of work, I think is a lot. To say that we just have to shake off all of the things that have happened, continue to happen in the ways people come into this country and are in this country long-term who don't see the need for this work and continually just throw it under the bus and disregard it in broadcloth. And you did not do that in this meeting. And I really appreciate that. But to expect us to just be resilient about the ongoing need to coach people, cajole people, I think is asking too much. So there needs to be some balance, not only between the demand for resilience, but also the competence that people bring into our ever evolving race-related, lineage-related context in the United States. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. Any response?
We also just wanted to say that we're happy to, if people have to disperse but you can we're happy to hang out and answer questions and have this conversation, so.
Or any other?
Did no one else? Something I was thinking about, it's interesting that there's a lot of concern about the negative consequences of DEI institutionalized practices, and that's like a huge concern. But no one seems to care that systems of meritocracy has statistically been shown to have continually repeat social patterns of exclusion, but that's not a concern at all.
No,
Which I think is
to
odd.
be clear, so the point is not, I think there are problems. And one of the things that I would critique about DEI is exactly that it makes, these trainings are coming and they're making it all about your personal way of engagement. And they're actually not addressing structural issues at all. So sorry, I am engaging for a moment. Let me dip my toe in the demonizing well and say that, it suits administrators just fine to not have that, to make it into an individual's issue and people have to work on themselves. I'm not denying that people have to work on themselves, but that's not going to address any structural issue in a meaningful way. It's a way of deflecting. And can I address the question that, is it Denise?
Yes.
I think, Denise, the point you made is very well taken about resilience, and one can't expect. I totally take that and I'm on board. But what I am finding on college campuses is that there's almost an incentivization to victimization is being incentivized. That's what I'm, so I think resilience in that model where the kind of reward structures we're setting up on campuses is such that everyone wants to be worse than the other person and say that I am the real victim over here. And that is the piece that I think is damaging.
Yeah, in terms of structural issues, right? Like if our college wants to recruit, let's say, more Black faculty, which we do, and which I'm strongly committed to. One approach might be, okay, well, let's make sure that the Jeff Snyders of the world, that their hearts and minds are pure, that they don't harbor implicit bias, that they're not racist, because that's the fundamental obstacle here, is either the overt or implicit racism held by faculty members and other people in positions of power. To my mind, I'd be much more interested in, for example, diversifying our applicant pool. Rather than trying to reach into my heart and see if I'm at core a racist and trying to work on my attitudes, I'd like Carleton to develop partnerships with historically Black colleges and universities. Deep partnerships with particular schools where you would establish relationships and you would be able to introduce a small liberal arts college like Carleton to populations that haven't been represented. So I think that we need to be very conscious and intentional about the strategies we use to recruit more diverse faculty. But to me, it's much more a question of resources, networks, than it is a question of individual psychology and attitudes.
Amir, can I say one more thing or no?
And then, yeah.
Okay, I was just going to say, I see this on my own campus and I see it on many other campuses. The amount of money that is being put into hiring these consultants. And I mean, they're the beneficiaries of this at the end of the day. I'd much rather see that money being put towards doing cluster hires for faculty, minority faculty. I'd much rather see that money being put towards developing, like Jeff said, relationships that help deal with the pipeline problem and help encourage historically minoritized populations to come in. Let's put our money where our mouth is my point. And I think the administrators aren't doing that. And that requires, it's a heavy lift. But if we're going to talk the talk, let's walk the walk.
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to respond to Denise as well, since I'm the one that brought up the resiliency thing. I think for me, it's a very sort of self-serving thing. If I look inward and I self-reflect and I have the choice how to respond to someone who's difficult, and trust me, I've tried all the strategies, I can't control another person's heart or mind or behavior. I can control mine. So if I'm being told by administration and training that my attitude ought to be to wear a chip on my shoulder and assume the worst thing I possibly can from everybody and feel terrible about whatever they say to me and interpret something as a microaggression, what it may or may not be. And I've done that when I was younger. It seems to be that the better strategy, and totally self-serving is to develop some sort of thick skin. It's not because I think it's right or wrong. I think it's just survival. And you're absolutely right. I completely agree with you that things are more difficult for some people than others. That's a universal truth. I'm on board with that. But I also think that leaves people with a choice on how to respond to things.
Steve has his hand raised.
Yeah, I just, something we haven't had a chance to explore tonight in this really good discussion. I really appreciate everyone's contributions here. Is the potential for equity. Andrew actually raises this, the potential for our emphasis on equity to lead us to de-emphasize the idea of merit. We don't do that in almost any sphere except the university at this point. We don't do it in science. We don't do it in business. We don't do it in sports. Why? I mean, yes, it's true that we have to do everything we can to provide opportunities and support and a pipeline. But you know, one of the things that really bugs me is that the idea of merit is becoming something you cannot speak in university. How? I mean, I'm not naive about this. I know there's an SES skew. I know there's a racial skew. We have to address those, but my goodness, do we really want to give up on the idea that there's things like meritorious contributions? I don't.
I don't either, but I think universities and colleges are in a pretty tight bind in this regard, because there's the ideal and the abstract, which I subscribe to. But then there's the ways in which colleges and universities, particularly admissions offices, actually operate. So if we think that getting into Harvard, right, is a sign that you've earned it, I've just seen these stats, right? The overall acceptance rate is 5%. It's 28% for legacies. That's a completely different applicant pool, right? If you're a recruited athlete, your chance of getting into Harvard is something like 87%. So I think it's going to be hard for universities to defend the idea of meritocracy when it's a complete fiction that the kids getting in are getting in because of their own merit. So I just think I'm not disagreeing with your central premise or the thrust of your idea, Steve, but I think it's hard for college universities to defend that when their admissions practices fly so clearly in the face of any reasonable understanding of merit.
You know, Jeff, I do agree with you about you know, there's all kinds of thumbs on the scales, and it's true that there's only 5% or less now who get into Harvard and Stanford. But if you look at the faculty, those people have usually contributed something, and we want them to contribute something. So, you know, I just worry about this, you know, this assault on the idea of meritorious contributions. You won't find that in any other sphere of American life, in my opinion.
So I think perhaps what you're talking about, you know, merit is usually like what I think what Jeff said, you know, about students getting in is what I think about. But I think what you're talking about is expertise and standards of expertise. And that, I think, I mean, there is an outright attack on expertise right now. We know that. And I think we have to be very careful that as we do this work, we don't compromise the expertise for a different value, which is very good. And I think we done right, we can do it. It kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier. I'd much rather this money be invested in helping students, in helping faculty, the pipeline issue, right? That's where the problem in great part lies, and helping those people come along, not actually rejigging the system such that it becomes weaker. So I think it's the expertise issue.
It's also about providing students with support.
Yeah.
If you wanted to ask me what the best potential DEI initiative is for boosting student retention, especially among first-generation students and students of color, would be to make serious investments in academic support services, things like writing centers, math support centers, because these are initiatives that will increase students' skills and knowledge, give them a sense of efficacy, which I think in turn leads to a sense of belonging. People want to feel efficacious. They want to be successful in the context that they're a part of. And there are various ways that you can do that, but I think, especially as an academic institution, let's invest on what we do best and know how to do best, which is helping people, become smarter, become more agile with numbers, empowered. Yeah.
I think since we're running over, I want to take one last question. Is that Eric? Or what's that?
Marisol had her hand raised first and then Eddie.
Okay. All right. I'll be quick. I wanted to let you know, since we're talking about merit, I wanted you be aware that we wrote along with like 28 other scientists, we wrote a paper about merit that it got rejected from several important journals, and we had to publish it in the Journal of Controversial Ideas. An article about this was written in the New York Times today, and there's also an article a couple of days ago from the Wall Street Journal. So I very much support the idea of merit, and I think most minorities, including me, I'm a Hispanic immigrant woman, I wouldn't want to be thought of as a diversity higher or inferior. That would be an offense to me. So, and I think to many other people, and some of these diversity ideas kind of promote, can cause this to happen. Regarding increasing diversity, a better use of time, money, and resources would be to, like Amna said, to bring students, let's say from impoverished areas in Michigan, let's say from Detroit, have the most excellent students in high school to be provided scholarships, etc., and then help. It's still, but in faculty, still hire the most meritorious person, also in students, but broaden, the type of people that will apply, wide advertising in wide places, etc. But always keep the idea that the best person, the most meritorious person or the most competent person should be hired, because science is more important than one person. We actually have an important role to discover things, to solve problems. In the case, I'm a nematologist and try to solve problems with nematodes in agricultural crops. So my role is important. I help farmers, reduce yields. And if you hire somebody that doesn't know how to do the job, it's a disservice to the growers. It's a disservice to the science. I think that choosing based on competence, it's more important than one person. Anyways, I wanted to let you guys be aware of that New York Times article and that Journal of Controversial Ideas article.
Thank you, Marisol. Eddie, you're our last question, then we have to let everybody go.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm coming in late on this conversation, so I really appreciate that you guys are having this conversation. It's sounded great so far. I think from what I've heard, one of the things that seems to be missing is a discussion about culture and how those things come into play. I think Glenn Lowry, obviously Thomas Sowell, a lot of other people have been talking about these kind of things, but I was just recently looking at the statistics, and for kind of proficiency in math and reading in the Black community was right about 15%. And so I think that's kind of addressing like the pipeline issue that's mentioned earlier. If there's only 13% of the population, and out of that 13%, it's only having 15% roughly of proficiency in things that would be necessary to be successful in academic fields, then it's going to be kind of hard, I think, to be able to fill some of the things, even with the best intentions, without lowering standards. And the lowering of standards, which a lot of the DEI programs and the equity programs kind of tend to go towards, it really has those pernicious effects, because representation matters, but it's meritocratic representation that matters, you know? I was working out in, outside of Tuskegee, out in that area, and I had a colleague of mine who was a primary care physician, and he had to work additionally hard in that community. It was majority Black kind of area. He was a Black physician because people didn't trust him because they thought that he had got his degree with lowered standards. So he had to work even harder just to earn the trust. So those are just some things that I think get lost when we're talking about some of the higher order things and not kind of that pipeline issue. I think it's very important about how to facilitate that, because even if you have programs in the universities for, you know, math learning labs, science learning labs, writing labs, utilization is a big factor there. And we've seen, I think the record shows that even some kind of students that come in from minority populations, when they get there, they're less likely to make effective utilization of those services, even if they are available. So just some thoughts as that, but I really appreciate the discussion. Wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to give real brief closing remarks. I really appreciate everybody's willingness to stay late. I want to send a huge thank you to our panelists, Carlos, Amna, and Jeffrey. This was a long time coming. I really appreciate it, to discuss these complex issues surrounding DEI ideology and implementation. I want to thank everybody who attended on Zoom and in person. Please stay tuned for future civic events. Our website is easy to remember, civic.ucr.edu. You can find us on Twitter, and you can sign up for a mailing list. But yeah, I really appreciate it. This has been great. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, of
And
course.
thank you, Carlos.
Good seeing you again.
Good to see you too, Carlos.
Always
All right.
great talking to you guys.
That's great.